Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. My name is Anwesha. I research AI governance and also manage the tech policy program at the Takshashila Institution. Today I'm joined by Anisree Suresh, who researches geoeconomics at the Takshashila Institution, and we will be talking about repeated IMF bailouts in Pakistan and how that's never led to a reform moment in the Pakistani economy. So, before we delve into the intricacies of Pakistan's economy, it would be great to get a brief overview of what an IMF bailout entails and the general role of IMF in an economy.
Thank you, Anwesha. So, IMF was created in 1944 as part of the broader Bretton Woods architecture created post Second World War. So, as part of the mandate, IMF seeks to promote global monetary cooperation and stability, and it also provides financial assistance and technical support to its member countries, especially those who are facing economic challenges and balance of payment crisis and everything. And it also provide policy advisory to prevent crisis, and it also supports foreign balance of payment adjustment and the stability in the exchange rate system and all those things. And mainly it assists low income countries and developing countries with concessional financing, debt relief and policy advice. And it provides its financial packages through various ways. They have something called standby arrangement, which are like a short term to medium term arrangement, which has linked to some policy conditionality, so that this probably would be like 6 months to 12 months kind of an arrangement, where they usually say that the country has to make certain kind of changes in their policy structure or the economic structure, so that they get the funding. And they have something called the extended fund facility as well, which is again a medium term arrangement that IMF provides, which also again linked to a policy conditionality. And extended credit facility in turn is linked to more specific policy condition, and it's more larger term in terms of when they get the payment and when they have to repay it. And there is something called structural adjustment facility commitment as well. So this is mostly for low income countries, and it's longer term repayment dues are also you have a lot of time to repay it back, and the interest rates are almost minimal, so that it's affordable for a lot of low income countries with limited access to financial markets. And if you look at the Pakistan case, Pakistan has approached IMF 25 times and using varieties of all these facilities that's available. And so IMF delivers its funding through something called special drawing rights, which is basically an international reserve asset of based on all the international currencies. So you have dollar, you have yen, and you have all this major international currencies there. And IMF allocates this SDR or special drawing rights to these countries based on their quota. So that quota is again determined by something called how much that economy is in terms of its size, how much is relevant to the global economy. So that's how basically IMF works as an institution.
Right. So you mentioned that Pakistan has approached the IMF 25 times. That's quite a striking number.
Yes.
That stands out even among developing countries. So can you help us understand the deeper reasons behind this recurring pattern, whether it's historical, geopolitical, or rooted in domestic and foreign policy?
Yeah. So it's a very interesting part of history, Anwesha. So if you look at it historically, so we know that British India, following the partition of 1947, you have both India and Pakistan, and they both inherit something called the colonial economy. So that means Pakistan's backbone of its economy is agriculture. That you have the majority of the workforce living based on the agricultural provisions or related provisions, and that's contributing significantly to country's GDP as well. So you have the agriculture as the backbone of the country. And then you look at the industrial output of Pakistan that was highly underdeveloped during that period. And it could be based on a lot of reasons colonial neglect, and you have only small scale manufacturing like textiles and handicrafts as being the major outputs of the economy, which are not really you don't have a lot of value or export earnings coming out of these economies, right? And you lack the infrastructure, the economy is lacking the technological capability or a skilled workforce to support the industrial development. So these all act as barriers for industrial development in the economy as well.
Right.
And then you look at the other aspect, the trade. again Pakistan inherits something called like the complex dependencies and the trade routes of British India.
Okay.
So that means like with partition, and you also have like immediate deterioration of relationship with India like in 1947 due to the contest over Jammu and Kashmir. So that means the commercial connectivity with India is like completely
Right.
it's plummeted. And so Pakistan faces immediately from 1947 onwards in maintaining trade relationship or trade or finding new trade routes as well. So that again affects the entire economy. So if you look at it, then the other aspect is partition itself. So partition leads to a lot of people moving across India and Pakistan. So the refugee crisis and the humanitarian concerns that are arising from all this, that all add to a strain on the economy. So when you look at it in the 1940s and the up to 1950s, Pakistan economy is like starting with all the structural weaknesses that they have. So that means they find very much problems in managing its finances, mobilizing its revenue, and addressing external imbalance as well. Moving into 1950s, so by then Pakistan already like has a lot of severe balance of payment crisis and everything, and you have like current account deficit and your foreign exchange reserves are like dwindling, all these problems, and there is a severe imbalance in the imports and exports. So like by 1950 the economy is in shambles already, right? And in 1950, so Pakistan joins IMF and then faced with a significant drop in the foreign exchange reserves, IMF launched its first bailout program in Pakistan in 1958.
Okay.
So by then, IMF was sought to immediately provide some kind of stability to the economy and also like implement certain policy reforms and everything so that certain kind of growth and stability can be boosted. And then you look at it from 1958 to 1977, Pakistan enters multiple standby arrangements with the IMF during that period. So we also have to understand there, 1965, Pakistan again goes to war with India in the contest over Jammu and Kashmir again. And that war has a lot of economic repercussions on Pakistan economy. Like you also know that there's like the cost of war has been like quite a lot. Like you need money for military operations, deployment of the troops, and procurement of the equipment and all those things, which strains Pakistan's fiscal resources. Then 1971, Bangladesh independence.
Yes.
So again, Bangladesh was also like area where you have a lot of resources, and most of the industrial output used to come from the East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. So with that link, that connectivity also goes away, Pakistan struggles a lot. And then if you look at it, I know it's a bit long because you have to understand the history to understand
Right.
like why we are not leading to the IMF reforms and everything. And from 1978 to 98, you have Ziaul Haq coming into power, and very important aspect of policies like you asked whether foreign policies have any connections to leading to this IMF reforms and Pakistan's instability as an economy. So during Ziaul Haq era, again you have to see the global context. That's a time that Soviet invades Afghanistan, and that means that America is very much interested in the region. So they are like there's an influx of lot of aid grants and money coming from US, and it's also the same time that Ziaul Haq do a lot of like Islamization of the financial institution. That means you have a lot of money coming from Gulf countries as well, especially from Saudi Arabia. So however, what that creates is like a debt dependency in the Pakistan's economy, and inadvertently it leads to an enable of elite catch-up. But again, Ziaul Haq tries certain kind of reforms during this period. Like you see a lot of deregulation or attempts at privatization happening during this period, but not much success. Then following in the 88 to 99, you have hybrid regimes of Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif as well. But again, the trend has already set. You have external debt dependency. You're like extremely dependent on all the countries for putting their money into the economy, and their foreign policy is extremely reactive and militarized in the sense 88 to 99 you have again 99 Kargil war, that's again putting a lot of pressure in the economy, and 98 nuclear tests that triggers US sanctions, And that's only period like 1 or 2 years you don't have any IMF bailouts happening, because like US sanctions, all those things, like they're not getting any money. But again, in the 99 to 2008 Musharraf era, you have 9/11 happening. That's
Right.
mean war on terror, and US is back again in Pakistan's field. So then you again get a lot of money. But then by then, like despite there were bit of economic growth here and there, there's not much progress happening, and the structural fragility throughout these years till now persist. So that means like your high external debt, low revenue mobilization, tax collection is like almost non-existent, and even though there was some attempts at privatization and FDI-led growth, it doesn't lead to much success due to a lot of factors. So, yeah.
Right. So, the IMF typically ties its bailout packages to a series of, economic reform conditions aimed at stabilizing and restructuring economies. But in Pakistan's case, however, we've seen a long history of repeated bailouts without much evidence of structured, sustained reform or, structural transformation. But why is that so? What factors have contributed to Pakistan's persistent dependency on IMF support, and why have these reform efforts consistently failed to take root?
Yeah, indeed, Anwesha, you're absolutely right to point out that. And it's actually a paradox, like, at the heart of Pakistan's economic history with the IMF. So, like, while the IMF role is, like, it was intended to be a temporary stopgap so that the economy can be stabilized and implement certain kind of structural reforms. In the case of Pakistan, it became something called a cyclic lifeline. That means, like, despite Pakistan approaching IMF 25 times, there has been no sustainable growth or transformation happening in the economy, right? And there are like multiple reasons behind this. So one of the reasons is the chronic structural weaknesses. So like we explained earlier, like, there are like quite a lot of structural weaknesses that the Pakistan economy has been carrying over the years. And from being an agriculture dependent economy to not being able to develop its industrial base, it's like something that they have been struggling. And along with that, you have a very narrow export base. So most of the export is based on like low value added sectors like textiles or handicrafts, which again is going down due to various other factors along with productivity. So your productivity of the economy is like going down extremely high.
Right.
And then you have weak taxation. So tax to GDP ratio in Pakistan is one of the lowest in South Asia, and you can say that a lot of reasons are behind it. One is mainly elite resistance to taxation, and like you have weak institutional capacity to implement taxation. So that's again like when main issue out there. And then along with that, you have public debt accumulation, like over the years, like whether it's US, then it's Gulf monarchies, and then the China. Pakistan has been extremely dependent on this external debt that's coming into the economy. Then you have poor industrial diversification and persistent energy crisis that are continuing to destabilize the macroeconomic framework of Pakistan. Then the second main aspect is the elite capture and governance failure. So economic policy in Pakistan has been often dictated by the elite interest, whether it's feudal, whether it's military or industrial, it has been captured by elite interest. So although there was some attempts at privatization, most of the time it was not able to reflect into the broader economy because of this elite capture of power. And definitely that means that there is a lack of political will and institutional follow through that has prevented sustainable reforms regardless of who was in power, whether it was military or civilian governments, doesn't matter, like because of all these existing issues. And like I think we already discussed this part, but just to reiterate, and then the third aspect is the militarized and reactive foreign policy. Right. So like you discussed, like Pakistan had repeated conflicts with India, and that means like in 1965 or 71 or 99 or even the recent one, these strategic choices and these militarized choices diverted the revenue resources away from development to defense. So that means like you're struggling as an economy, and this kind of adds a weightage to that too. And again, like during the Pakistan's alignment during the Cold War, as well as the war on terror, brought it again, like, it had brought certain kind of short-term aid to the economy, but they kind of like substitute real reforms with this kind of short-term temporary supply of money. But that what happened is like real economic growth never happened. So yeah, then again that all means that the country developed a serious case of debt dependency, and they used all this money that they're getting from all these countries as a aid for geopolitical services they are providing as a strategic client state in the region, especially to US during the Cold War, as well as in the war on terror, like with all the Afghanistan issue and everything. But there is no real economic reform happening domestically. So, I think to summarize, you can say that while IMF had pushed for certain reforms over the time, they mostly focused on certain austerity measures and not much on the what's the real growth that's happening inside. And also although despite the push for reforms, the Pakistani institution lacked the capacity as well as the incentive to push for real reforms.
So I want to double down on what you have been saying, that there's a lack of reform attempts, or serious reform attempts within Pakistan. Now, when we compare that to India, India faced a payments crisis a balance of payments crisis in 1991,
Yeah.
and that's when we also turned to IMF, and as a result, there were significant economic reforms in that era, such as liberalization, privatization, and globalization, which then became the bedrock of our subsequent economic rise.
Yeah.
Now, in comparison, were there any serious reform attempts, particularly in taxation, industry, or energy?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting example that I could actually take is the energy sector. So apparently during that period, especially in the 1990s, there were a lot of public and global public appraisal for Pakistan's adventure into the energy reform sector as such. However, it's a very interesting study, how even a market reform can be failed if there are no proper incentives for the market to function properly. So one is that in 1990, the Pakistan initiates a major reform called the 1994 Independent Power Producers Policy, IPP policy, which was basically designed to attract private investment and foreign investment into the electricity generation. So right now, if you look at it, this has led to the rise of private investors in the power generation today, and almost half of the electricity in Pakistan is now generated by these IPPs. However, what happened with this policy is there are a few things that went wrong with this arrangement. One was that this IPPs, these producers were offered guaranteed profits in US dollars despite the local economic condition. That means whether they win or lose, government offered that we will provide you guaranteed profit to whatever they're doing. So what it did is it completely de-risked the private players from its investment, and it shifted the entire burden into the Pakistani state. So this is particularly damaging because of multiple reasons. One, mainly all this IPP, since there is no risk in this investment, most of them instead of using domestic supply or looking at proper economically viable options, they imported all the furnace oil for this electricity generation. Okay, so that means your import bills, which is already high initially, is soaring up again, right? And second aspect is this kind of furnace oil based electricity generation is 8 times higher than the usual hydropower electricity generation. So that means your electricity bills are soaring up, right? And the third aspect is, so that means your energy costs are increasing, and most of the time when the government fails to pay this profit that they guarantee to the IPPs, whenever they fail because lack of money in this thing, the IPP stop producing electricity. So that means your entire manufacturing units, everything suffers because of lack of money. And over the time, what this manufacturing units have started doing is they have their own private electricity generation things. So that means that's more price, right? So it adds to the price of total manufacturing, and it reduces the export competitiveness of a product that's coming out of Pakistan. So that means while this was a really great market-based reform, that ended up being financially unsustainable, and mainly because it externalized risk and encouraged costly energy choices instead of looking for economically viable options, and failed to create a resilient energy mix in Pakistan. And if you look at it, this is very closely linked to the trade policy. So like I said, like, because it has increased the cost of production in Pakistan, your export competitiveness is going down. So that one of the key factors, like, why Pakistan is not able to compete globally when it comes to its products. Even if you look at it, textiles, historically textiles has been one of the sectors that Pakistan has been really good at. But the productivity in textiles industry has gone down significantly. They were not able to add any kind of more value to the sector, so the productivity is going down. You don't creating anything new, so you have a like a economy that's not moving forward at all. Right. And then along with that, you're not able to diversify your exports and all these things. And most of the time, all the manufacturing production in Pakistan is dependent on uh, raw imports, as well as like you have to import the machinery, capital, right, everything for the production. That means like you have a higher cost production. So the trade is also highly affected by that. So I think energy sector is actually one of the interesting areas of reform that you could look at. That there will be, although there was an initial push for reforms, when you don't have the proper will to follow through and see like how we can modify it, this ends up in disaster.
Oh, wow. So, given Pakistan's current economic crisis, the country has once again turned to IMF, and while the latest package may have helped avert a default, many of the underlying structural issues that you mentioned, they've remained unresolved.
Yeah.
So, in your view, what lies ahead for Pakistan?
So, uh, so again, going back to the reforms, all of the reforms, although they push for certain kind of reforms, there were a lot of issues, right? And mostly they had a lot of like design flaws and everything. And until and unless there is a fundamental shift in governance and policy priorities, I think the key bailouts is not a sustainable solutions. Maybe they might be able to improve the certain macroeconomic indicators for a very short term, but until and unless you have a like a proper domestic reforms happening at home, I think this is not a sustainable solution to Pakistan. So if you look at it right now, the economy is in like really bad state. I think 2023 it was really in bad state. In 2024 it was able to do slightly better, but again it's still not have like overcame its critical state yet. So you have foreign reserves that's plummeting, and which is barely able to cover a few weeks of imports in Pakistan. And you have chronic fiscal mismanagement happening with high deficit and debt servicing consuming the majority of public revenue. And along with all these issues, you also put more import restrictions on all the imports coming into the Pakistan, which again, like since I mentioned, like a lot of the local manufacturing in Pakistan is dependent on uh, the imports coming from other countries. So like you put more import restriction, that means like you actually like the cost of production in Pakistan is also going up, right? So, and along with that, you have a structural weaknesses that we have discussed from the beginning of this conversation, with undiversified export base and low productivity in like most of the sectors, and you have a very high bloated public sector, which is like serving very little to its people. Right, and if you look at it, only 2.5% of the population filed tax returns in 2024, right? Wow. So that's like really bad. And so that shows that like until and unless you're able to fix all these issues, like how are you going to improve the economy, right? So what is the result of all these measures? Again, you have like the country is not able to manage its international payment obligations. The deficit is increasing. Cost of imports is like consistently outweigh export earnings. So there's no revenue coming from there. And you have imported energy, which again raises the cost of electricity, transport, and basic production in Pakistan. But behind all this macroeconomic data lies a very devastating human cost, right? That poverty is now at 40% in Pakistan. Oh, wow. And then you have Pakistan ranking like 109th out of 127 in the global hunger index. And then your public investment is abysmal in the future. That means like you're spending less than 3% in health and education, and it's one of the lowest globally. And youth unemployment is at high, and Pakistan is one of the top 5 countries with illegal immigration to Europe. So that shows that there is a lot of despair and lack of economic opportunity at home, right? So although this IMF package provides certain kind of a relief temporarily, it does not fix Pakistan's underlying vulnerabilities at all. So I think if history is any guide, and how what we discussed so far, bailouts alone is not gonna be enough for the economy, and you need to have a lot of reform ownership and see, like, how can we reform the economy. But then again, considering the current political uh, issues there, I'm not sure like how much you can induce, but that's the future for Pakistan. So they have to, I think, even now the 25th time of bailout, there are a lot of conditionalities on, like, oh, you have to increase the tax base and everything, but then you have to address all these issues and ensure that there is a broadened tax base, and somehow you address the elite capture and of revenue structures, and again do a lot of revamping of energy and industrial policies and invest more in the human capital. And so overall, by ensuring institutional transparency and regulatory stability and allowing a lot of trade to happen, I think overall you might be able to slowly bring the economy from the shambles.
Right.
But then until and unless this is just a temporary fix to the yeah.
Thank you, Anisree. This was a very, very insightful conversation, and we'll see you for the next episode.
Thank you.